Okay, welcome. Weekly Marx, 12 January 2025. We're in chapter 4 of the Princeton edition of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1. And we're going to continue reading it, but I wanted to make some remarks first. Yes, I added more crap at the end. It uh, I don't know if it's good or bad, but the difference between Heinrich and Mosley, and Fred Mosley makes a reasonable set of questions about what Heinrich, in his sort of magisterial way, considers a more final word on issues of value form. So I know that this is tedious on the one hand. On the other hand, when we go to Marx himself, we begin to see that certain elements are have you can sort of see what Marx is trying to get at, and you can also see what was necessary at the front end, that is to try and load everything into the front to sort of explain it as an introduction and sort of clean it up in volume 3, so that either maybe Engels at work or Marx. But if you've ever seen the scrawls of the manuscripts, Marx Marx could have used a ballpoint pen, I think. I think he would have been better off with a ballpoint pen. Anyway, needless to say, a lot of ink got spilled. There is a book. It's a fairly short book, but it is a book that I found little fragments of in Google Books, and it is uh, Fred Mosley's book of only a year or so ago on Marx's theory of value in Chapter 1 of Capital. It is Mosley's work critiquing Heinrich, and it, you know, there is controversy. But on the other hand, it's a way in which we can sort of rethink the whole business, and that's what Marx was trying to do in terms of capital. That is, the most abstract element of modern bourgeois society, i.e., of capitalism, is the commodity. The other elements of capitalism, that is money, capital, wage labor, etc., are particular forms of commodity. Therefore, the starting point of Marx's theory of the actual concrete capitalist economy is the commodity. The commodity is the end of the analytical first path and the beginning of the explanatory second path. So Marx expressed this conclusion at the end of the Grundrisse in preparation for the first draft of Capital One in the A Contribution, hitherto named Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. And Marx says the first category in which bourgeois wealth presents itself is that of the commodity. The commodity itself appears as the unity of two aspects. This is that dual thing. It is use value, that is, how does use value become transformed into commodity? It is vehicle of exchange value. And Marx attributed this logical method to Hegel, although in an idealist form. Along the first path, the full conception was evaporated to yield an abstract determination. Along the second, the abstract determinations lead towards a reproduction of the concrete by way of thought. In this way, Hegel fell into the illusion of conceiving the real as the product of thought concentrating itself, probing its own depths, and unfolding itself out of itself by itself, whereas the method of rising from the abstract to the concrete is only the way in which thought appropriates the concrete, reproduces it as the concrete in the mind. But this is by no means the process by which the concrete itself comes into being. Now, this sounds like a little, a rigmarole here, bafflegab, I suppose. But I think it's really important to think about how, Hegel is saying, well, thought is really important. You need to sort of focus your thought on the world. It is possible to have to try to achieve knowledge in a way that you can transform reality into a kind of knowledge. The problem is that that kind of knowledge, is not a continuous; it's a discontinuous path that is always fraught with contradiction, and that's kind of the thing about being in the world. So 2 years later, from the Grundrisse to the contribution, Marx began chapter one of the contribution as follows. The wealth of bourgeois society at first sight presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Every commodity, however, has a twofold aspect, use value and exchange value. Thus, the subject of analysis of chapter one is a unit of a single commodity, a representative kind of commodity that is used to analyze the main properties that all commodities have in common, use value and exchange value. In the preface to the contribution, Marx referred back to his introduction on method in the Grundrisse. Several years later, 1863, from whatever it is, 59, Marx wrote the following in section one of a manuscript entitled Results of the Immediate Process of Production. Section one is entitled Commodities as Products of Capital. As the elementary form of bourgeois wealth, the commodity was our point of departure, the prerequisite for the emergence of capital. On the other hand, commodities appear now as the product of capital. The commodity that emerges from capitalist production is different from the commodity we began with as the element, the precondition of capitalist production. We began with an individual commodity viewed as an autonomous article in which a specific amount of labor time is objectified and which therefore has an exchange value of a definite amount. So, there is making a relation between thought in general and thought in particular in that particular way. And in fact, it is a kind of comment on how we subjectively deal with the world. Then in volume one of Capital, Marx described the subject of chapter one in essentially the same way as in the contribution, continuing to emphasize that his subject is a single commodity as a unit of the immense collection of commodities produced by capitalist production. The wealth of commodities in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity. And, this is, without getting into too much nuttiness, this is, phenomenologically speaking, this is what you kind of confront. You go into the store and there's a thing, and then you kind of, and not no one sort of says, well, that's a commodity, and therefore I'm going to make, figure out why I want it, or I do want it, or whatever. But all those things sort of are there relative to the commodity thing, because, unless you're going to steal it, shoplift stuff's going to have to kick in. In his preface to the first German edition of Volume 1, Marx describes the commodity with an analogy to anatomy. The commodity is the economic cell form of bourgeois society. The study of an organism in anatomy starts with an individual cell and an analysis of the general properties that each individual cell shares with all other cells of this organism, that is, structure, function, behavior, etc. Similarly, Marx's theory of capitalism starts with the economic cell form of an individual commodity and an analysis of the general properties that it shares with all other commodities: use value and exchange value, substance of value, magnitude of value, form of appearance of value. Marx said that the analysis of the commodity seems to turn on minutiae. Well, but so does microscopic anatomy. Now, this goes all the way back to, the atomism that Marx studies, Epicurus or whatever in his dissertation. Finally, in his notes on Adolf Wagner, Marx described the starting point of his theory in another very clear statement, which begins as follows. What I start out from is the simplest social form in which the labor product is presented in contemporary society, and this is the commodity. And Marx continued with a brief summary of section one of chapter one, which serves as a good introduction to section one. That is, I analyze it, the commodity, and right from the beginning, in the form in which it appears. Here, I find that it is, on the one hand, in its natural form, a useful thing, alias a use value. Can I use this? On the other hand, it is a bearer of exchange value, and from this viewpoint, it is itself exchange value. Further analysis of the latter, that is, the exchange value of the commodity, shows me that exchange value is only a form of appearance, the autonomous mode of presentation of the value contained in the commodity. And then I move on to the analysis of the latter. Now, I know you do this every time you go into a store, right? But the fact is, we don't, all of these things seem natural, but we do make those kinds of decisions, or at least if you're a smart shopper, let's put it that way. You make price comparisons, cost per unit, weight, how much money I have in my pocket, how much money I have in the bank, whatever. All of these things are at work. You don't make them necessarily all at the same time, but they're kind of all there and are all possible. So, by way of further introduction to Marx's logical method in Chapter 1, this is Fred Mosley, I will briefly describe the fundamental concepts in terms of which Marx's analysis of the commodity in Chapter 1 is carried out. The substance of value, that is, the objectified, abstract human labor contained in each commodity, the magnitude of value, that is, the quantity of objectified, abstract human labor, and the form of appearance of the substance and magnitude of value, that is, exchange value and money prices. The subtitle of Section 1 of Chapter 1 is Substance of Value, Magnitude of Value, and the title of Section 3 is the value form or exchange value. So all of the elements are kind of there. Section 1 of Chapter 1 begins with the form of appearance of value, that is the exchange value of a commodity, and derives the inner substance of value, that is the objectified abstract human labor contained in the commodity. Section 1 also defines the magnitude of value as the quantity of objectified abstract human labor contained in the commodity, which is exclusively determined by the socially necessary labor time expended to produce it. And we've heard all of that before, but there is a kind of thing there, and you're not making these decisions at every moment, but you do have these thoughts that go into your mind. You see a pint of strawberries, and you sort of go, okay, well, it costs this amount, and it costs whatever amount at some other store, and you sort of make these kinds of decisions about whether you do or don't want it. You look at the is it spoiled? Is it not spoiled? Is it, is it overripe? Is it not ripe enough? Or you make all kinds of odd decisions, but then you have other things that are part of your abstract thought. Strawberries retain more pesticides than any other kind of fruit in terms of being picked. So it makes it more problematic in terms of just simply buying it as a consumer. Now, you don't make all of those little thoughts when you're kind of, shopping, but the fact is those things are all still there. They're still there when you buy the damn thing and you go out, and if you forgot about it and you suddenly realize, oh, damn it, is more washing this fruit going to get rid of that pesticide or not? And, there's all kinds of, and then therefore you have regret. You could even take it back, whatever. Anyway, Section 2 further clarifies the distinction between abstract human labor and concrete useful labor, and also clarifies the meaning of socially necessary labor time, in particular explaining how qualified, that is, skilled labor, is taken into account. Section 3 then begins with the presupposition of objectified abstract human labor as the substance of value, and the quantity of objectified abstract human labor as the magnitude of value. So objectified abstract human labor as a presupposition, and then the quantity is, the magnitude is derived in sections 1 and 2, and 3 derives money and prices as the necessary form of appearance of the presupposed substance and magnitude of value. Yeah, I know we all make these decisions before we get to the checkout counter, but Section 4 explains the origin of the fetishism of commodities, according to which commodities seem to possess value by themselves, independently of the labor that produces them. So, with all that at work, there's more, but you can just go down a rabbit hole there. And speaking of rabbit holes, we're looking at the proverbial chapter 4 of Marx, volume 1, chapter 4, and we were sort of partway down, and I hopefully today we'll get to the end. Those who consistently advance the misguided theory that surplus value results from a nominal price increase or from a seller's privilege to sell his commodities for more than they're worth, thus assume, this is Marx, that there is a class of people who buy but don't sell, who, in other words, consume but don't produce. From the standpoint our analysis is reached, that of simple circulation, we can't yet explain how such a class could exist. But let's jump ahead. The money that this class of people buy with must constantly flow to them from the commodity owners themselves without exchange. The money must be free by might or by right. To sell such people commodities for more than their value would merely be to swindle back some of the money that was given away. The cities of Asia Minor paid an annual tribute of money to ancient Rome. With that money, the Romans bought their commodities at inflated prices. The people of Asia Minor fleeced the Romans, taking the route of trade to con back from their conquerors part of a yearly tribute. Yet the people of Asia Minor were still the ones being taken advantage of. The money that they were paid for their commodities was their own money after all. That isn't the way to become rich or generate surplus value. Darn tariffs. We will therefore stay within the limits of commodity exchange, where sellers are also buyers and buyers are also sellers. Perhaps our difficulty stems from how we have been conceiving of the persons involved, mainly as mere personified categories rather than as individual people. Commodity owner A is crafty enough to fool two of his colleagues, B and C, despite their best efforts, and they're unable to return the favor. Owner A sells wine worth 40 pounds to B and in exchange acquires grain worth 50 pounds. He's transformed his 40 pounds into 50 pounds. He has made less money into more, turning his commodity into capital. But what exactly has happened here? Before the exchange, there was $40 worth of 40 pounds worth of wine in A's hands and 50 pounds worth of grain in B's, a total value of 90 pounds. After the exchange, the total is the same. The value circulating hasn't grown by even an atom. All that has changed is how the 90 pounds has been distributed between A and B. Now, what registers as surplus value on the one side registers as negative value on the other. What registers as a plus on one side registers as a minus on the other. The same change would occur if A stole 10 pounds from B outright, although the form of exchange conceals this fact. Clearly, the sum of circulating value can't be increased by changing how it's distributed. Now, note, of course, that Marx is Jewish, just as a Jew can't increase the amount of precious metal in a country by selling a farthing from the time of Queen Anne for a guinea. Taken as a whole, the capitalist class in a country can't cheat itself. The outcome will remain the same, however much one twists or tugs. When equivalents are exchanged, no surplus value is generated. And when non-equivalents are exchanged, it still isn't generated. Circulation or commodity exchange does not create value. Now, this is, of course, why our analysis of capital's elementary form hasn't yet said anything about merchant capital and usury capital, those famous and, so to speak, antediluvian forms of capital. And it has instead focused on the form that capital has when it determines the economic organization of modern society. The MCM prime form Buying in order to sell at a higher price finds its purest expression in true merchant capital. But the movement of M prime occurs entirely within the circulation sphere. And because it is impossible from the standpoint of circulation to explain how money is transformed into capital, that is, how surplus value is created, merchant capital looks impossible as long as equivalents are exchanged. Thus, merchant capital appears to be something that takes place only when the merchant parasitically inserts himself between commodity owners who are buying and selling in order to bilk both of them. This is what Benjamin Franklin had in mind when he said, war is robbery, commerce is cheating. Now, if we don't want to think that merchant capital is valorized only when commodity owners are defrauded, we would need to take into account a long series of mediating factors. And here, at a point where we're only presupposing only commodity circulation and simple components, these factors are entirely absent. Now, what holds for merchant capital applies even more to usury capital. In merchant capital, the starting point and the end point, namely the money put into the market and the greater amount taken out, are at least mediated by a purchase and a sale, or the movement of circulation. In usury capital, the form M prime is shortened to the unmediated starting point and end point, that is M prime, money that is exchanged for more money, a form that contradicts the nature of money and thus can't be explained from the standpoint of commodity circulation. Hence, Aristotle says there are two kinds of chrematistics. One has to do with commerce, the other with household management. Remember, economics is ultimately about household management. The latter is necessary and commendable, but the kind that has to do with exchange is justly disparaged, since it's not natural, but it is from one another. Hence, usury is very justifiably detested, since it gets wealth from money itself, rather than from the very thing money was devised to facilitate. For money was introduced to facilitate exchange, but interest makes money itself grow bigger. That is how it gets its name, interest and offspring, for offspring resemble their parents, and interest is money that comes from money. Hence, of all the kinds of chrematistics, that this one is the most unnatural. Later, we will see that, like merchant capital, interest-bearing capital is a derivative form. And we'll also see why they emerged earlier than the modern elementary form of capital. Our analysis has shown that surplus value can't arise from circulation. That when surplus value is created, something has to go on behind circulation's back, something that can't be seen in circulation itself. But can surplus value arise anywhere besides the circulation sphere? Circulation is the sum of all the mutual relations among commodity owners. Outside the circulation sphere, an individual commodity owner has just one relation left, that is, his relation with his own commodity. With regard to the value of his commodity, the relation is limited to the fact that his commodity contains a quantity of his own labor measured according to definite social laws. This quantity is expressed as the commodity's magnitude of value, and because its magnitude of value is represented as money of account, it is expressed as a price, say 10 pounds. But the owner's labor isn't represented in the commodity's value, and a surplus beyond that value as a price of 10 pounds that is at the same time a price of 11 pounds, or in other words, in a value that is greater than itself. The commodity owner's labor can create values, but not self-valorizing values. His labor can enlarge a commodity's value, that is, adding new labor. He can supplement existing value with new value. For example, making boots from leather. The same material now has more value because it contains a greater quantity of labor. The boots have more value than the leather, but the leather's value remains what it was. It didn't valorize itself. It didn't take on surplus value as the boots were being produced. Outside the circulation sphere, the commodity owner can't valorize his value without coming into contact with other commodity owners. And so he can't transform either money or a commodity into capital. Capital then can't arise within circulation, just as it can't arise outside circulation. And it has to both arise and then not arise there. Our analysis has thus yielded a double result. So there's a kind of, with respect, an antagonism there. Now, how money is transformed into capital has to be explicated on the basis of the immanent laws of commodity exchange. That equivalents are exchanged, therefore, has to be our starting point. Our money owner, still a capitalist in larval form, has to buy commodities at their value and sell them at their value, yet in the end, extract more value from the process than he put into it. He must and can't metamorphose into a butterfly in the circulation sphere. This is what we're up against. Hic Rhodus, hic salta. Now, buying and selling labor power. When money turns into capital, where does its change of value occur? Not in money itself. As a means of purchase or payment, money simply realizes the prices of the commodity it buys or pays for. And when money clings to its own form, it hardens into a magnitude of value that remains the same. Let me break here for a second and note inflation would be, a total radical change. A hyperinflation would be even more radical version of this. All right. The money's value also can't change in the second act of circulation, that is, a commodity's resale, because this act merely transforms a commodity from its natural form back into the money form. The change has to take place in the commodity that is purchased in the first act of circulation, M-C. Yet the value of this commodity can't change during the act of exchange because equivalents are being exchanged. The commodity is bought at its value. So the change in the money's value has to proceed from the commodity's use value as such. That is, the change has to take place when the commodity is consumed. In order to extract value from the consumption of a commodity, our money owner must be lucky enough to find circulating in the market a commodity whose use value has a special characteristic of a source of value. When this commodity is actually consumed, labor would be objectified and thus value would be created. The money owner does, in fact, find just such a commodity in the market, labor capacity or labor power. By labor power and labor capacity, we mean all the capacities that exist in a person's bodily form and living personality, and that he activates whenever he produces use values of any kind. Various conditions have to be met before the money owner can actually find labor power on the market as a commodity. Commodity exchange in and of it and in and for itself doesn't imply any relations of dependence except the ones arising from its own nature. Given this, labor power can appear in the market as a commodity only insofar as, and because its owner, the person it belongs to, offers it for sale or sells it as a commodity. And if the labor power's owner is to sell his labor power as a commodity, it must be fully his, something that he can do whatever he wants with. He must be the independent proprietor of his labor capacity, of his own person. The owner of the labor power and the money owner encounter each other in the market and enter into a relation as commodity owners of the same standing, different in only that one buys and the other sells. They are equals before the law. In order to maintain this relation, the owner of the labor power must sell his commodity for a limited time only. If he sold his labor power all at once in one big sale, he would be selling himself, transforming himself from a free person into a slave, from a commodity owner into a commodity. Here, a person must always treat his labor power as his property, hence as his own commodity. And he can do that only insofar as he puts his labor at the buyer's disposal temporarily, only insofar as he gives up his labor power to be consumed for a specific time period. He has to dispose of his labor power without renouncing ownership of it. A second essential condition needs to be met before the money owner can find labor power in the market as a commodity. The labor power's owner can't sell commodities in which his labor has been objectified. Instead, he has to sell as a commodity his labor power itself, which exists only in his living body. A person obviously has to own some means of production, for example, raw materials, instruments of labor, and so on, in order to sell commodities other than his own labor power. He can't make boots without leather. He also needs some means of subsisting. No one can live on the products of the future, that is, unfinished use values. People have to consume things every day, both before they produce and while they're producing, just as they had to on the first day they appeared on the world stage. In addition, the things that people produce as commodities have to be sold after they've been produced, and they can satisfy the wants and needs of their producers only after they've been sold. The time it takes to sell commodities has to be added to the time it takes to produce them. A money owner has to find a free worker in the commodity market, free in two senses, in order to turn money into capital. A money owner has to find a free worker in the commodity market, free in two senses, in order to turn money into capital. As a free person, the worker can do whatever he wants with his labor power. He can sell it as his own commodity. Furthermore, he is otherwise commodity free. He has none of the things he needs to realize his labor power. The money owner finds the labor market ready-made as a particular division of the commodity market and isn't interested in why he encounters this free worker in the circulation sphere. For the moment, neither are we. We're proceeding from this fact on the level of theory, whereas the commodity owner does so on the level of practice. But one thing is clear. Nature doesn't produce money owners or commodity owners on the one side and people who own only their labor power on the other. Now, this relation comes from natural history just as little as it is a social relation that we find in all historical periods. Clearly, it's resulted from a prior historical development. It was produced by many economic revolutions in the past or a whole series of older formations of social production going under. The economic categories we examined earlier also carry traces of history. A product's existence as a commodity contains veiled within it definite historical conditions. If a product is to become a commodity, it can't be produced to serve its producer directly as a means of subsistence. Let's say that he'd gone further and asked, under what circumstances do all products, or even just the majority of them, take on the form of a commodity? We would have seen that this situation is always based on a very specific mode of production, the capitalist mode. But such a line of inquiry would take us far from an analysis of the commodity. Commodity production and commodity circulation can occur even if the vast majority of products being slated to meet the immediate needs of their makers aren't turned into commodities, or where exchange value is still a long way from reigning over all areas of the social process of production. In order for products to be fashioned as commodities, the division of labor within society has to be developed enough for use value and exchange value to be fully separated, a process which merely begins with direct exchange. We find this stage of development, however, in economic social formations that belong to very different historical moments. Let us now consider money, which exists only once a certain level of commodity exchange has been reached. Different forms of money, money as the commodity's mere equivalent, money as the means of circulation, money as the means of payment, money as stores of money, and worldwide money indicate very different stages in the social process of production, according to the extent and relative preponderance of one function or the other. Nevertheless, experience shows that even relatively undeveloped commodity circulation allows all these forms to emerge. Not so with capital. Its historical conditions of existence aren't yet present in the simple circulation of commodities and money. Far from it. Capital arises only where a person who owns some means of production and subsistence finds a free worker in the market selling his own labor power, and this one historical condition holds within it a whole history of the world. The appearance of capital announces a new epoch in the social process of production. Let me break there and remind you of my yammering about Italian banks. Here, then, we need to look more closely at labor power, that special commodity. Like all other commodities, it has a value. How is its value determined? As with any other commodity, the labor time needed to produce this particular article and thus also reproduce it determines its value. Labor power, insofar as it is value, represents nothing but the particular quantity of socially average labor objectified in it. Labor power exists only as a capacity that belongs to a living individual. This individual must therefore exist in order for labor power to be produced. So to reproduce or maintain this individual is in fact to produce labor power. Since a living individual requires a certain amount of means of subsistence, the labor time needed to produce labor power equals the labor time it takes to produce these means. In other words, labor power's value is the value of the means of subsistence needed to maintain the labor power's owner. Labor power is realized, however, only by being expressed, and it is only activated in labor. When it is activated in labor, a definite quantity of human muscle, nerve, brain, and so on is expended, and this quantity has to be replaced. If more is expended, more has to be replenished. If an owner of labor power works today, he must be able to repeat the same process tomorrow with the same strength and health. Thus, the total amount of means of subsistence must suffice to maintain the working individual as a working individual in his normal state. His natural wants and needs, such as nourishment, clothes, heating, housing, and so on, vary according to the climate and other natural features specific to a country. But the extent of his so-called necessary wants and needs and his way of satisfying them are themselves historical products, and thus they depend to a large extent on the stage of culture that his country has reached. Among other things, the conditions in which members of the class of free workers are formed also play an essential role here, since they shape the habits and living standards of those workers. Moral and historical factors help to determine labor power's value, in contrast to what we find with all other commodities. In a given country, in a given period, the average amount of the necessary means of subsistence is nevertheless a known datum, as in the singular unit of data, right? The owners of labor power are mortal. If the person selling his labor is to appear in the market continuously, as he must, when money is continuously transformed into capital, he has to perpetuate himself in the way that every living being perpetuates himself, by procreation. The labor power that wear and tear and death take from the market must always be replaced with at least as much labor power. Thus, the sum of the means of subsistence needed to produce labor power has to include the means of subsistence for replacement, the workers' children. That is how the members of this race of special commodity owners perpetuate themselves in the commodity market. A particular kind of training or education is needed to modify the general nature of human beings in such a way that they become skillful and deft in a particular branch of labor, or in other words, become developed and specialized labor power. This training, in turn, costs an equivalent in commodities of a greater or lesser amount. Educational costs differ according to whether the character of labor power is mediated a little or a lot. Vanishingly small for ordinary labor power, these costs count as part of the overall value spent to produce labor power. Since labor power's value equals only the value of a certain sum of the means of subsistence, it varies with the value of those means, i.e., with the magnitude of the labor time required to produce them. Now, some means of subsistence, for example, food, heating, and so on, are consumed daily and must be replaced daily. Others, such as clothes and furniture, last longer and don't need to be replaced as often. Commodities of one type must be bought and paid for anew every day. Other types must be bought or paid for weekly, monthly, quarterly, and so on. But however the sum of these expenditures is spread out over the course of a year, an income of certain daily average is needed to cover it. If the total amount of commodities consumed daily to produce labor power equals A, and the commodities consumed weekly equals B, quarterly equals C, and so on, then the daily average of these commodities will be 365 times A, 52 times B, and plus 4 times C, and so on, divided by 365. If we assume that 6 hours of social labor are embedded in the quantity of commodities needed for an average day, then half a day of socially average labor is objectified daily in labor power. So to produce labor power daily, half a day of labor is required. The quantity of labor required each day to produce labor power, constitutes labor power's daily value, or the value of the labor power reproduced daily. If half a day of socially average labor is also represented in an amount of gold worth 3 shillings or $1, then $1 would be the price that corresponds to the labor power's daily value. If an owner of labor power sells his commodity for $1 per day, then its price equals its value. And according to what we assumed above, the money owner who's so keen to transform his dollars into capital pays just that amount in value. The lower or minimum limit of labor power's value is the value of the commodities that the labor power's bearer, a human being, needs daily in order to keep renewing his life process. The value of his physically indispensable means of subsistence. If labor power's price falls to that minimum, it will have fallen below its value. Under such circumstances, labor power can be maintained and cultivated only in a broken condition. But what determines the value of every commodity is the labor time needed to produce it with its normal level of quality. Now, this method of determining labor power's value proceeds from the nature of the thing itself, and it is an extraordinarily cheap type of sentimentality that finds it harsh, whining along with Rossi, quote, to conceive labor capacity, the puissance de travail, while one abstracts from the worker's means of subsistence during the production process, is to conceive a phantom, être de raison. Someone who says labor or labor capacity is also saying the worker and his means of subsistence, the worker and his wages, unquote. But saying labor capacity isn't the same as saying labor, any more than saying the capacity for digestion is the same as saying digestion. Digestion, as we know, requires more than a strong stomach. It also needs food. To say labor capacity isn't to abstract from the means of subsistence needed to maintain it. The value of these means is, in fact, expressed through labor capacity's value. If a worker doesn't sell his labor capacity, it does nothing for him. Instead, he will experience a terrible natural necessity, the fact that his labor capacity, in order to be produced, has required a certain quantity of means of subsistence, and it keeps requiring those means all over again in order to be reproduced. Like Sismondi, he will discover that labor capacity is nothing unless it is sold. The special nature of labor power, that singular commodity, is such that when a seller and buyer close their contract, the buyer doesn't actually have labor power's use value in his hands. As with every other commodity, labor power's value is determined by the particular amount of social labor expended to produce it. And so its value is determined before it enters into circulation. But the use value of labor power doesn't come into being until its power is expressed, which happens only after it's been sold. There is a temporal gap then between the moment when power is parted with and the moment when it is in fact expressed or exists as a use value. When the moment that the use value of a commodity is formally parted with by being sold and the moment that the buyer actually gets the use value don't coincide. The buyer's money functions most often as a means of payment. In all countries under the capitalist mode of production, labor power isn't paid for after it has functioned throughout the labor period that is established by the purchase contract, for example, at the end of each week. So the worker always advances the capitalist the use value of his labor power. He lets the buyer consume it before the buyer pays him. In other words, the worker always lets the capitalist buy on credit. This extending of credit is no mere illusion, which we see not only when wages bought on credit are lost due to the occasional bankruptcy on the part of a capitalist, but also from a series of even longer lasting consequences. Whether money functions as a means of purchase or of payment, however, has no effect on the nature of the commodity exchange itself. Labor power's price is contractually established, even if its price isn't realized until afterwards, as is the case when a house is rented. Labor power has, in fact, been sold, even if someone pays for it only later. To gain a pure understanding of this relation, it can thus be useful to assume that the labor power's owner always receives the contractually stipulated price on the spot. We have seen that what determines the value a money owner pays a owner of labor power for his special commodity. In return, the money owner gets use value that first appears during consumption, or in the process during which the labor power is actually consumed. The money owner buys everything he needs for this process in the market, such as raw materials and so on, paying full price. The process whereby labor power is consumed is simultaneously the process of producing a commodity and also the process of creating surplus value. Money power is consumed outside the market, i.e., outside the sphere of circulation, just like every other commodity. Let's therefore leave this noisy sphere which resides on the surface for all to see. Leave together with the money owner and the labor power's owner and follow them into the hidden place of production. As we're about to enter, we will see a sign, quote, "No admittance except on business," unquote. Here we'll learn not just how capital produces things, but also how capital is produced. The secret of turning a profit will be revealed at last. The sphere of circulation or commodity exchange within whose limits the moment the movement of buying and selling labor power occurs is in fact a veritable Eden of innate human rights. What reigns is exclusively freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, freedom, because only the free wills of the buyer and seller of a commodity, for example, labor power, equal because only the free wills of the buyer and seller of a commodity, for example, labor power, determine how these figures act. They enter into business dealings as free persons equal before the law. The end result is the contract that represents a joint legal expression of their wills, equality, because they interact only as commodity owners and exchange an equivalent for an equivalent. Property, because each owner does whatever he wants with only what is his. Bentham, because each cares only about himself. The only force that brings the two parties together and into a relation with each other is self-concern, private interest, personal gain. And precisely because each person thinks only about himself and no one else, and also as the result of the pre-established harmonious order of things, or perhaps under the auspices of an infinitely shrewd providence, their work advances nothing but mutual benefits, the common good, and collective interest. Something changes, or so it seems, in the physiognomy of our dramatis personae upon leaving this sphere of simple circulation or commodity exchange, the sphere on which the vulgar free trader bases his views, concepts, and the standards he uses to judge a society of capital and wage labor. The former money owner now strides ahead as a capitalist, while the owner of the labor power follows him as his worker, one grinning self-importantly, eager to do business, the other wary and reluctant to continue, like someone has brought his own hide to the market and cannot expect anything other than the tannery. And you know, I think it's just good to understand what Marx is thinking about here, that there is this divergence between capital and labor. And so we're at the end of chapter 4. There's all kinds of endnotes that we can get to. I assume that you will. I've exceeded my time. Let me mention a couple of editor's notes that are probably useful. For example, editor's note 9. The verb Marx pairs with process, in a sense, is erloschen, a term with a literary flavor that often has the sense of extinguish, as it does here, except that Marx is using it in a way that doesn't match how extinguish is used, namely, but as an active but intransitive and non-reflexive verb. The German verb schweigen, to be silent, but not just that, poses a similar challenge for English translators. In English, someone generally extinguishes something or a thing is extinguished. But we don't say that a thing extinguishes when we want to convey that it dies out or dims and disappears and so forth. So if a translator goes with extinguish here, the process in the sentence loses some agency because it will be extinguished. Now, it may be relevant here that erloschen, not exactly the most obvious word choice in this context, sounds like the verb erlosen, whose primary meaning is to redeem, as in spiritual or religious redemption. After all, the motif of Christianity figures prominently in Marx's discussion of the metamorphosis of commodities and the formation of capital. So anyway, without getting too far into the craziness, but you could see that little sense of it here in the translator's, the editor's notes. I leave that to you to note that we have actually gone to the end of the damn chapter 4. To note also that there is a structure of argument that is still being maintained in Marx's Capital, despite the addition numbers, etc. Fred Mosley here, of course, is making one type of comparison with that is a similar comparison that we saw with the Komura text on Friday, and so not a lot of progress has occurred in the 40 some odd, 60 some odd years, the difference between the two texts, with all due respect. So I included some of a review of Mosley's text done by, surprise, surprise, someone who teaches economics at an art school, which amuses me even further. It's a review by Jason Smith at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, commenting in H Socialism, that is a listserv for socialists or social people interested in social isms, on Fred Mosley's text. And I leave that to you. I'm not sure that Smith has quite the right interpretation, but because he's a comp lit guy as opposed to an economist, but it does reveal sort of the nature of things as they might be. Also, with all due respect, paths untaken. Anyway, okay, that's what I need to have said. And yes, of course, I've gone over my time massively. And let me ask if there are any questions, comments, or brickbats. Tollers, yes, yes. Are German, I guess, I assume German currency, or yes, decisions capitalists take extra credit for, indeed. So we cannot say that Trump or Musk don't take care of their offspring. No, they delegate it. They have a division of labor that, Baron Trump was essentially taken care by Melania. There's bare contact between poor Baron and Donald. Jesus was a socialist, indeed he was. Let's see. Yes, Marx needed a word processing thing at least. Yes, ibuprofen. Yes, Ozempic, indeed. Let's see. What's a band? Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, seaside resort in Devon. Yes, Jeremy Bentham's head. Anyway, favorite joke of those who spend time in London or the University of London. Anyway, all that being said, no interventions, brickbats that you want to get on record in the live stream. Let me stop share.
I have a question.
Oh,
I mean, you could stop the thing if you want to.
Okay.
Before.
I will stop the. Oh, I didn't see it. I'm sorry, I didn't open the thing. I didn't see. I wasn't looking at the hands.
Okay. Well,
Go
anyway,
ahead, Nancy. No, no, I haven't cut the live stream.
oh, so
Please
it's
talk.
about this leather and boots and the value of the leather.
Yes,
So I think I disagree with what was said there because I deal not with leather, but a similar thing, textile
yes.
scraps. So the leather, if somebody has
The leather. The,
pardon?
I now let me just get ahead of you there and say, he ends with talking about the tannery. So I think he does imply that there's more labor process before you get to leather. So I'm trying to preempt what you said. Is that what you meant?
No, he's saying that the leather retains its value even in the boot. So the point is, when you make the boot, you have offcuts.
Ah,
So, in my experience dealing with cotton textiles, those things basically become trash. So, if you've made something, then per square inch or added up into yardage, maybe the thing increases the uh, relative, you know, value of an area of fabric. But
yes.
the part that's normally discarded becomes uh, actually a burdensome kind of a trash product.
Hmm.
Or in the case, what I spend a lot of my time doing is trying to reassemble all those garbage bits into something useful again.
Indeed.
And
You're
if it's
doing what's called valorizing.
right. So, I mean, I'm just saying the value of the leather, it's not static at all.
No,
And the value of probably anything isn't static.
no, of course, yes.
So, uh,
No, you're quite
yeah,
right, and and your intuition is correct. It There's a lot more at work here.
but I think that's a big part of the problem that we run into. And it's sort of, unconscious is uh, people, like I know people think they're going to get something at the thrift store. This has become sort of a big thing. And then they're going to sell it for more.
Ooh, yes,
Or people have collected things and they think that because it's part of their collection, it's more valuable than it really is.
right.
Uh, and on the bigger social scale, I think that's a big problem where we have, right now we have these oligarchs feeling like they have the value, they own the value, and it's only a matter of us agreeing to go along with their assessment that
Yes,
puts us in the hole, really.
yes.
Anyway,
No, no, that's all intuitively correct. That we value added, the surplus value, comes from all these kinds of elements. It's clearly the case that making of quilts, etc., from what some people would say is a byproduct of a process, is valorizing. It is valorizing. It valorizes in innumerable ways. For example, the rediscovery in the 1960s and 70s of quilt makers and women's work, as it were. Uh, the entire history of quilting, it became was elevated to quote unquote a art form when the rediscovery of quote unquote folk art became important at the museum level, and it was always important from a a history museum level, but from an art museum level, then it arose in the context of women's art, for example. So there's an entire body of work there, yes. And the added value, of course, has to do with reputational elements. And reputation is nothing if but, kind of, peripheral, epiphenomenal, invisible, transparent, whatever. And but yet people sue each other over reputational harm or damage, which always becomes a joke when you think about Trump. But anyway, yes,
Yeah, it's the emperor's new clothes all over
exactly,
again.
exactly,
Thank
exactly.
you.
So this is, Marx is making clear points here. He's thinking about this and refining it. I mean, you can see where it goes from the Grundrisse, to the contribution to capital. That he's trying to work through this, and he's doing a lot of rewriting. And then there's Engels sticking his nose in. So this is a process of a fair amount of fiddling around. And So yes, a good point, Larry. It's a value moment. These are things that Marx is observing in the context of being buddies with Engels, and all of these things. Excuse me, all of these things are there. Let me now exit from the live stream. Uh, I'm assuming that Star Trek is available at 5. Is that so, John?
Yes, I am going to make it so, Ed.
What's the title of our episode today?
The
I haven't
title,
stopped the live stream yet.
okay. The title is Hide and Q.
Oh no.
Yes,
Oh
yes.
God.
Oh, I like Q episodes. You don't like Q episodes?
Gee. No, I assume there's a population of Trekkies who just, I mean, they acknowledge that Q is an important, uh, omniscient element of Star Trek, and John Delancey, is always does it with such relish. Um,
Yes, yes.
but he is so many times annoying. Although there is one episode where becomes vulnerable, which I find that the best episode. Um,
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, when his
he sort of
powers are taken away.
Yes, and he learns. I think he learns something there, but I don't know. It may simply be that he's is in a passive aggressive relationship with the continuum. But anyway, let me stop the live stream there.